Hello, everybody. This is Abel here in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Just wanted to talk today about just been seeing images coming out of Yemen of that place being destroyed and children starving to death there. And the thing is that the media bombards us with all kinds of information about Syria and the disaster there, but we don't hear very much about Yemen. And I think what's interesting is that there's different accounts of the U.S. and the Saudis and Russia and the Syrians and all these terrorist groups that U.S. and Saudis have been supporting and arming. And everyone has different opinions about Syria and what should happen there and who are the criminals, who are the good guys. I would say they're all criminals and all bad guys, but what's happening in Yemen is more clear cut, though, because it's mainly the U.S. and the Saudis, the Saudi dictatorship that the U.S. has been arming. Both Obama and Trump have sold record amounts of weapons to the Saudis. Bombs and warplanes that are being used to to bomb Yemen to pieces. And now there's a massive humanitarian crisis that's just as bad as Syria. But we don't hear much about it. But I think what people have to accept is that it's very simple why so many people in the Middle East hate us and why so many people want to become terrorists, and we're bombing and destroying people's civilization. And you drop a bomb on one suspected terrorist and kill 10 innocent civilians. All their family wants to become terrorists. We're manufacturing terrorism. It's really simple math, and it's a shame that people can't think enough to even put together 1 plus 1. This is not complicated algebra. It's not rocket science. But what do we do, right? And Trump is not the problem. I mean, he's a problem, but he's not the problem. The problem is the system. The problem is capitalism. The problem is our democracy is being corrupted. Even, it never was a perfect democracy. It always had problems, but we've made some improvements, but we've also made many, many steps backwards, especially with the corruption of elections, with campaign finance, corporate personhood. And, the problem is inequality. It's what capitalism creates inequality. And it's this, the issue is power. When you're talking about politics, you have to talk about power. And the issue is power concentrated in the hands of one or a few people, or is it distributed among the people relatively equally? And obviously, power is concentrated in the hands of the billionaire class, the oligarchs, the people that are able to fund elections, the people who can afford to buy TV commercials. I mean, we talk about the Supreme Court ruled in Buckley in the 1970s that money equals speech. Well, if money equals speech and corporations are people, corporations can spend, and millionaires and billionaires can now spend, massive sums of money on campaigns to buy politicians from both parties, establishment politicians especially. And the thing is that if money is speech, a billionaire can scream, and not just that. When we look at Trump, he got over $3 billion in free airtime on the major corporate media stations. And so one of these billionaires can scream at 1,000,000,000 decibels, if decibels are dollars. And, the average citizen can't hardly speak. We have to squeak out through YouTube or, Facebook or whatever. We can't speak on mainstream corporate media. I mean, the voices of the people are very much a minority on these stations. And, we really, we talk about fake news and everything, and it is an important subject. The media is very important. That's how people become informed, and democracy doesn't function if people aren't informed. And the reality is about media is that, And it's not just Bill Clinton, but he's a big part of it. He signed the Media Consolidation, the Telecommunications Act in 1996, and that allowed the media companies to consolidate now into five massive corporate conglomerates or so. And so now a handful of billionaires that own these companies control the content, and this is it covers 90% or so of everything we hear, read, and see, and on TV and cable news and radio and films, Hollywood, books, everything. It covers magazines. It covers everything, and so the independent journalists are a small minority. The ones that aren't corporate media, the ones that aren't necessarily partisan, Republican or Democrat. They independently criticize corrupt politicians or warmonger politicians from both parties. And, the average citizen has a hard time encountering these kinds of alternative media. I mean, some of the ones that I've found tell the truth in the highest proportional amount on the important issues are something like, Democracy Now! Or The Intercept with Glenn Greenwald, Truth Dig, Truth Out, Tom Graham in terms of empire and militarism and war. Let's see, what else? Common Dreams is really good. Z Magazine, Counterpunch, those kinds of things. And these are really respected journalists. Check out John Pilger. These are world-class journalists that aren't allowed to speak on corporate media. And, an example of corporate media, the thing is there's a code of journalistic ethics that says there's not supposed to be any real or perceived conflicts of interest. So if you're a journalist, you need to have some kind of integrity and some kind of dedication to speaking the truth and seeking the truth and saying things that are unpopular and uncomfortable, especially for politicians or corporate elites. And, for instance, at one point, a few years back, before some merger happened or some kind of buyout, General Electric was this massive conglomerate, owned NBC, and they also manufactured engines for war machines. And then you had a sincere peace candidate like Dennis Kucinich running for president in 2008. And this is someone that voted against the Iraq War, voted for every funding bill since, someone that sincerely stands for peace in terms of Israel. It goes on and on. That guy is a champion for peace. And when NBC hosted debates, they put Kucinich on the edge of the stage and gave, what they call the top tier or the serious candidates that were able to raise millions of dollars from, the rich right away, Obama, Clinton, and John Edwards. And then there was even other debates where they completely excluded Kucinich, just like they exclude third-party candidates, sincere peace leaders like Green Party candidates, Nader and Jill Stein, and people like that are not allowed to debate at all because they don't want serious voices for peace. I mean, we are a war economy. In many ways, a huge part of our manufacturing is creating war machines. It used to be other things, but a lot of that's been exported through free trade to dictatorships like China and elsewhere, where, in China, they can violently suppress the biggest costs for a corporation, which are labor and environmental laws, regulations. So a dictatorship can suppress those things and offer extreme competitive advantage for companies to move there because they can get virtual slave labor if they're paying a tiny fraction of what they pay in a quasi-democracy like ours, where we have labor laws and benefits for workers and some environmental protections. We talk about free trade, like we should trade with China on an even playing field, even though they're a dictatorship. You don't trade with a country on an even playing field when they're a dictatorship, because you will lose. And the clear thing is that corporations are in charge. Multinational corporations are in charge, and the owners of these corporations don't give a fuck about the people of the United States. They don't give a fuck about the people of China. They don't give a fuck about the environment. They care about profit. And, as long as they're in some gated community in some mansion, they don't care if the rivers are being polluted in China. They don't care if the rivers are polluted in India or wherever. And these people have no conscience. They just care about money. They worship money. They're the opposite of everything Jesus stood for. I'm not really a Christian, but I like a lot of what Jesus said. And, he said you can't serve two masters. You can only serve God, which I believe is love. You can't serve love and money. You can only serve one or the other. You got to serve your heart, or you got to serve some external idol of some sort, whether it's the flag or the dollar bill or some sculpture, a cross. When I think that the important part of Jesus was his life and not his death, his living words. And if you believe that in spirit's eternal, so spirit doesn't die. So Jesus didn't die. And, worshiping on his death, I think, is fucking up the message, to be honest. But in terms of media, let's see. Well, maybe we could talk about something else. I lost my thought. Some things I've also been thinking about. I've been reading a lot of Eric Fromm, and he's got so many good books. He's one of the brightest minds that ever existed, and it's a tragedy that not enough people know about him. I mean, some of his best works are, The Art of Loving, which deeply impacted Martin Luther King. He spoke about that. The Sane Society, Psychoanalysis of Religion, Escape from Freedom. One of my favorites is On Disobedience. So on disobedience, he says that, really, disobedience is actually a good thing. We're taught to be obedient, obey, and listen, follow the law, and just do what the government says. But it's actually good to disobey. And what Fromm says is essentially you have to disobey and you have to obey. The matter is, what are you obeying and what are you disobeying? So if a law is unjust and you feel that in your heart, you can either be obedient to that unjust law or you can be obedient to your heart. You have to disobey one or the other. So do you disobey your heart or do you disobey the unjust law? And it's very critical that we learn to obey our heart and conscience, or someone could say the voice of God. You don't have to say that word, the voice of internal collective consciousness, whatever you want to call it, but the Great Spirit. But you have to obey one or the other. And I have tried in my life, and I don't always do it perfectly, to obey my heart. And even if that means disobeying unjust laws. I mean, you can look at the marijuana laws, for instance. That's clearly unjust that they're locking people up for using a plant, putting people in prison, destroying their lives. My life was very much wrecked by the drug laws. And sure, you could say I made bad choices, and I accept that. But at the same time, I felt in my heart that these laws are unjust, and I didn't feel wrong in disobeying them. I actually felt good about it. I felt that it was right to disobey unjust laws. And part of this idea of obedience too and disobedience is, for instance, if Trump was to crack down on a lot of our freedoms, then, in many ways our democracy is already deeply undermined. And Princeton study says it's an oligarchy. We don't have democracy. But I would argue that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution are very, very important. The freedom of speech, the First Amendment. Thank you to Thomas Jefferson. He's our best president because of the Bill of Rights. By far, that's the most important thing we have, the freedom of speech and freedom of the press, freedom of religion. And, if some disaster happened, these rights are already under attack to a large degree because of the war on terror. Under Bush and Obama, these rights have been attacked. The rights to privacy, mass warrantless spying from Bush and Obama, unconstitutional, illegal. They both should have been impeached. And not just that, they're both guilty of war crimes, as is Clinton. The war in Iraq and the war in Libya, those were criminal wars. I mean, they're both termed illegal wars. For it to be a legal war in terms of international law, this is post-World War II. We set up the United Nations. We set up bodies of international law of war crimes. And the supreme international law in terms of war crime, the supreme international war crime is a war of aggression. And this is after the Nazis were, tried, and they established the Nuremberg Charter. And it says, a supreme international law is a war of aggression, where a country aggressively attacks another country. And the only legal way to go to war is if A, that country directly attacks you, or B, you have authorization by the UN Security Council. And both Iraq and Libya did not have those authorizations, and neither does Syria. And, the U.S. has been engaged in Syria illegally, and all these other dozen countries they've been bombing in, Pakistan and Yemen, all these other countries. These are war crimes. They're violations of international law. And the only reason that the war criminals, Bush, Obama, Hillary, and Trump promised war crimes. He promised to torture, which is a war crime. He promised to bomb families, that's promising a war crime. The other presidents pretend they're not war criminals, but Trump is promising to be a war criminal. And so the American people were stuck with two deadly choices, Trump and Hillary. War criminal A or war criminal B. Sure, Hillary has a few slightly better domestic policies and whatever, a little bit of social policies, but deeply on policy of war and deep corporate policies, she was still terrible. And the only reason these war criminals can escape accountability is because the United States didn't sign the International Criminal Court. It didn't ratify it. They signed it but didn't ratify it. Many other countries have signed and ratified the International Criminal Court. So there's no enforcement mechanism. The United States is the most powerful economy and military, determines a lot of the world events, and so they can escape accountability that way. But it's my neighbor. What else? Okay, Eric Fromm, Disobedience. Yeah, so if they start cracking down on civil liberties even more, say try to establish something like martial law, or some people say we're already halfway there in terms of they're trying to crack down on dissent and protests. They could criminalize protesters, call them terrorists, economic terrorists, whatever. We saw what happened in Standing Rock. But people have to disobey. I mean, if they start putting curfews and trying to really restrict people in a lot of ways, people need to be ready to disobey. And it's actually a virtue to be disobedient. If you're obeying your heart, you're being virtuous in your disobedience. Well, that may be it for today. Maybe I'll do another one of these if it works out. Bye.